So there's been another mass shooting. Each time one of these heart-wrenching atrocities takes place on American soil, it triggers in us the same set of predictable behaviors. Pre-scripted almost. At this point, like the learned reactions of Pavlov's dogs. Yet all the thoughts and prayers, all the marches, all the hot-tempered cable news segments and journalistic think pieces ultimately crash out, exhausted of energy, against one seemingly immovable object. The Second Amendment. However, the Second Amendment isn't really the problem. The problem is with all the falsehoods we've been trained to think about it with. What if we've all just been, this whole time, simply looking at the Second Amendment the wrong way? A way the Founding Fathers never did, and never intended us to. What if both the pro-gun and anti-gun mania so easily observed in Americans today is just the result of decades and decades of accruing, slowly snowballing bad habits we've picked up? Like young children who were born with perfect posture, but gradually learn to slouch as they grow up. The Second Amendment doesn't have to be an insurmountable obstacle to common sense gun laws. Follow along with me here, and you'll finally see the Second Amendment for what it really is. It's not too late. You, as an American, could still have the open mind required to get back to healthy constitutional basics. So much of the innocent blood that continues to get spilled is very much because you don't understand the Second Amendment.
The Second Amendment hasn't always been a complicated issue, not at all. Before 1980, that is for a span of 191 years, there were just 3 or 4 Supreme Court cases that even concerned the Second Amendment. The fact that there's so much hot-blooded intensity and turmoil about guns and gun laws right now just proves what a distance we've come from our own history and our own Constitution. Maybe you're a gun rights extremist, and you believe the Second Amendment means the Founding Fathers wanted you to have an arsenal of high-powered weapons so you could stand up at any time to federal government tyranny. Or maybe you're on the opposite end of the spectrum, and you believe that gun control under our constitutional order could mean that all guns could be seized from all people. If you're even close to either of those positions, the actual history of the Second Amendment is not with you. It took centuries for the Second Amendment to become a controversial thing, but it is now. So we're long overdue for a deep reckoning with the actual history of the Second Amendment, so we can all, as Americans, finally come to understand it.
First off, remember, the Constitution's Bill of Rights doesn't grant people rights. The Bill of Rights only protects rights that people already have, just by nature of being the people. This is specifically true of the Second Amendment. The right there specified is that of bearing arms for a lawful purpose. This is not a right granted by the Constitution. Neither is it in any manner dependent upon that instrument for its existence. The Second Amendment declares that it shall not be infringed. United States v. Cruikshank. So right there, we've just highlighted something about the Second Amendment that most Americans probably don't recognize. And that is that the right to keep and bear arms predates the founding of the United States. The right doesn't exist because the Founding Fathers wrote it down. In fact, if you believe in the whole natural rights philosophy that America is based on, then you don't need a constitution. You don't need a Second Amendment. for the people to have a right to keep and bear arms. And these words from U.S. v. Cruikshank demonstrate terrifically that our highest arbiter of what the Constitution means, the Supreme Court of the United States, has long recognized that principle. But if the Founding Fathers all essentially agreed that the people have a natural right to keep and bear arms, then why do we have a Second Amendment? And what role is the word militia playing in it? That's the question that we need to start tangling with right now. And as always with the Constitution, you want to start by taking a close look at the text. So let's move on to a detailed close-up of the language of the Second Amendment. A well-regulated militia, being necessary to the security of a free state. The right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Most modern scholars get hung up on interpreting the Second Amendment because of this phrasing, which is especially odd when you compare it to the rest of the Bill of Rights. The Second Amendment has been broken down into what they call the prefatory clause and the operative clause. And many say these clauses mutually cloud and obscure each other, making the whole thing more confusing. The prefatory clause explains what the purpose or background of the amendment is, and the operative clause specifies the right that is not to be infringed. Anti-gun people, in particular, leap on the prefatory clause. No other portion of the Bill of Rights contains anything like this. For instance, the First Amendment doesn't have its own prefatory clause, saying something like, freedom of conscience and vigorous and open debate being necessary to the citizens of a republic, before it goes on to talk about the freedom of speech. So we have to ask, why isn't the Second Amendment more like the First Amendment? Why doesn't it just say, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed? If that was all the Founding Fathers intended to communicate, it would have been simplicity itself for them to just record that one statement for posterity. But that's not what happened. They put this pronouncement about the militia in there. The prefatory clause was intentionally placed first. And it's not a separate, independent expression. That's not a period that comes after the prefatory clause, it's a comma. So these clauses were deliberately linked. This is the Constitution we're talking about. And although the document contains some generality enfolding terms of art like necessary and proper or high crimes and misdemeanors, bedrock wisdom about the document has always been that no part of it is superfluous or meaningless. So anti-gun people leverage this as evidence that the Second Amendment's prefatory clause is there to clarify and limit the right to keep and bear arms language that comes after it. To put it another way, those anti-gun people believe that the way the Second Amendment is constructed proves that it is all about the militia and has nothing to do with an everyday American's legal capacity to own guns. That often leads to the flawed conclusion that only, say, men and women serving in the National Guard can exercise the right to keep and bear arms. That's the whole crux of the modern debate over the Second Amendment. Everyone talks about it like it's either all about individuals or it's all about the militia. So time and time again, the Second Amendment keeps getting fed to us as a binary choice with one interpretation overruling or negating the other. That whole approach is where we keep going wrong, because it's the binary choice itself that is entirely mistaken and off base. We should really be thinking about the Second Amendment the way the Founding Fathers and the Americans of the Revolutionary and early Republic eras thought of it, with the individual right and the militia right working together and enabling each other. All right, so think of it this way. The individual right to keep and bear arms and the rights of the people of the American states to protect themselves and their local governments with the militia is like a bubble inside a bubble. The two separate but necessary rights coexist in the same space, but one is smaller and more constrained than the other. The prefatory clause of the Second Amendment is the outer, enveloping bubble that covers Americans at a macro or social level. The operative clause is the inner bubble that covers Americans at the individual level. What I'm saying is, yes, the inner bubble protects the individual right to keep and bear certain sorts of arms for certain lawful purposes. And the outer bubble protects the collective right to keep and bear certain other sorts of arms for certain other lawful purposes. And to different degrees and under varying circumstances, both rights are subject to a certain amount of regulation by the authority we the people vest in our elected and appointed representatives. There should be nothing at all controversial about the existence of an individual right to keep and bear arms. Remember that it's not just the United States as a whole that has a constitution. Every state has one too. And for most of the states that existed at the time of the American Revolution, those constitutions are older than the one that contains the Second Amendment. Many of the state constitutions go even further to specify the natural rights the people possess. The right to defend and protect property, which includes your body and your life, are expressed in many of them. Here are two quick examples. First, from Virginia's Constitution. All men are by nature equally free and independent, and have certain inherent rights, namely, the enjoyment of life and liberty, with the means of acquiring and possessing property, and pursuing and obtaining happiness and safety. And from Pennsylvania's Constitution. All men are born equally free and independent, and have certain natural, inherent, and inalienable rights, amongst which are the enjoying and defending life and liberty, acquiring, possessing, and protecting property, and pursuing and obtaining happiness and safety. The contemporary Americans who wrote and ratified the federal Constitution overwhelmingly used one kind of technology to protect their lives and their property. Not booby traps and taekwondo, firearms. And on a side note, many of the Americans of that day, and even today, use firearms to acquire property also, through hunting. So any question about the original intent of the Founding Fathers maps onto this historical fact neatly and logically. Americans' enumerated rights to obtain safety and defend property are logically expressed in the individual right of the people to keep and bear arms. This, of course, is the inner bubble in our visual metaphor. But what kind of firearms does the individual right actually protect? You may have a right to free speech, but you don't have a right to yell fire in a crowded theater. You may have a right to possess property, but not high explosives, illegal drugs, stolen goods, child pornography, or equipment to make counterfeit money. Possessing most of those constitutes a felony crime. This all serves to demonstrate the principle that no right is unlimited. American law has always held this. Some conduct interferes with others' rights, or poses dangers, or is a nuisance to public order. The Constitution isn't just about liberty, it's about ordered liberty. There can be reasonable restrictions put on all kinds of rights. That includes what's covered by the Second Amendment. Here is an important distinction implicit in the right to keep and bear arms. The individual right to use firearms to prevent others from criminally preying on you and your property protects only one class of guns: non-military firearms. Or to put it another way, firearms that have a primarily non-military purpose. Why is this? Because those are the same kind of weapons that the Founding Fathers and their brethren legally used and kept for that express purpose. It's only logical to conclude that they anticipated that their descendants would use those as well. Now, does this mean that the only weapons the individual right protects are the flintlock pistols, muskets, Fowlers, and rifles of the founding era? No, that would be ridiculous. If we held the Constitution to that standard, then none of the Bill of Rights' other protections, like those against unreasonable search and seizure, would apply to our modern communications like telephones and computers. Freedom of speech wouldn't encompass films, social media, and video games. What's really at issue and what the individual right to keep and bear arms applies to is the class of arms. The modern handgun, shotgun, and rifle are, without a doubt, greatly improved over the single-shot, smoothbore sidearms and shoulder weapons that were used in the 18th century. But in terms of how these weapons are used, where they are used, and what they are primarily used for, 21st century pistols and single-action long guns still conform to their Revolutionary and early Republic counterparts. Let's review. Do the people have an individual right to keep and bear firearms? Yes. Why? Because the American founders recognized a right to defend property and obtain safety, and they took for granted that firearms were the best tools for those purposes. But this individual right operates way down on the scale of a person or people in small groups. It's equal to the scope of what was then expected from a single individual to render effective militia service within a larger chain of command. So the individual right only extends to a certain class of weapons. What class of weapons? The class of weapons Americans have historically preferred for self-defense and hunting. This includes handguns, shotguns, and rifles. Nothing that would match military-grade firepower, for instance, like automatic weapons. Now, rifles, shotguns, and handguns aren't never used in a military setting. And true, 240 years ago, they played a much more significant role. But even when the Redcoats and the Yankees were fighting in the 1770s and 1780s, the decisiveness of serious military action on a field of combat came down to another class of weapons entirely: artillery. For those who don't recognize the term, artillery means cannon, mortars, howitzers, and the like. I have heard this and seen it even in law articles, the assertion that founding-era Americans used the same weapons for personal protection as they did for military combat operations. Judges and lawyers and internet yahoos should all be more thorough with their history and their military history, because that strong statement is just not true. Yes, even in George Washington's time, when the Constitution was drafted and the Second Amendment conceived, neither a militia nor a standing army could win at war without artillery. That truth is why, for one example, in the winter of 1775 to 1776, General Henry Knox was willing to make such a logistically impossible, Herculean effort to capture and transport heavy weapons from Fort Ticonderoga in upstate New York. His crucial expedition went on to drag them, with boats and sleds, over 200 effectively roadless miles across snow-covered mountains. The game-changing artillery pieces were finally delivered to the Patriot Continental Army and the New England militia units who were facing the British, who had occupied Boston. When the British woke up to the fact that Washington had these cannon under his command, they evacuated.
So, what is the point of all this? I mean, why are we even talking about artillery? Well, it's to demonstrate that even in the late 18th century, there were weapons that were potentially so destructive that possessing them and using them fell totally outside the bounds of an everyday American's rights to acquire property and obtain safety. Everyday Americans did not own artillery pieces and have them in their homes.
Probate records and contemporary estate inventories confirm what we might otherwise chalk up to common sense. In fact, the exact same documents that prove early Americans kept a fair number of guns also prove they didn't keep and bear the kinds of weapons that were wielded exclusively by military forces. What this means is that even the minority of founding-era Americans who vocally pushed for something like the Second Amendment, and were themselves active members of the militia, respected a common-sense, uncrossable boundary between classes of weapons. That boundary is based on the power and potential destructiveness of those weapons. Certain deadly arms were appropriate for individual use, but others, they tacitly agreed, were weapons of war. Weapons that could and should only be trusted to public, state-authorized military establishments. Artillery pieces were often purchased by acts of state legislatures. And the weapons were kept in facilities usually called state arsenals. For example, in the late 1790s, South Carolina kept arsenals in Charleston, Abbeville, Georgetown, and Beaufort. The arsenals were overseen by state employees, arsenal keepers, and gunpowder receivers. The arms inside them could be used only when authorized by duly elected or appointed officials. Now, consider the case of today's street-legal semi-automatic rifles. They are, in fact, so potentially deadly and have such dizzyingly consequential advantages over the smoothbore artillery weapons the Founding Fathers were familiar with that they absolutely cross over the line into weapons of war. Let's take the example of a late 18th century, early 19th century 6-pounder cannon firing case shot, a kind of ordnance that was designed specifically for use against people, as opposed to, say, the reinforced walls of a fort. William Muller was an officer of the Engineers of the King's German Legion, who fought for Great Britain's monarch George III in the Napoleonic Wars. That's right, the same George III that Americans fought against in the Revolution was still kicking around decades later, fighting Napoleon. Muller conducted extended and meticulous tests of the artillery pieces and ordnance of his time. Now, a modern artillery scholar, British Major General B.P. Hughes, combined Muller's findings with, among other archival materials, records kept at period war engagements like the 1815 Battle of Waterloo, and other formal artillery studies roughly of the founding period. After exhaustive calculations, Major General Hughes concluded that 6-pounder cannon firing case shot into massed formations of enemy infantry at 200 yards would cause 150 casualties. That is 25 casualties per gun per shot. 25 casualties per gun per shot is not unimpressive. But there's something to think about here. What goes into making each one of those shots possible? For starters, you had to have a team of horses and a driver for that team of horses to actually transport your artillery piece into combat. It required a great deal of time to place a cannon and elevate the muzzle properly so the weapon would have some chance of actually hitting its target. Every time the cannon fired, it would recoil back 4 to 6 feet, forcing the crew to muscle it back up onto a carefully prepared shooting platform to fire again. Every shot of a cannon created a massive white cloud of gunpowder smoke that was extremely challenging to see through until it cleared. The smoke often slowed, sometimes significantly, further offensive or defensive action. Plus, a 6-pounder cannon could only be operated for short periods of time. After a few rounds of firing, it would have to cool off, or face the serious possibility of exploding and maiming or killing its own crew. On top of this, a smoothbore founding-era cannon couldn't easily swivel. It couldn't provide firepower over even a small arc, or quickly and dynamically respond to moving targets. But most importantly, an artillery piece like this required 5 highly trained professionals to operate it with anything close to efficiency. An artillery officer, a spongeman, a ventsman, a loader, and a firer. 5 people, plus horses and a driver, plus a heavy support wagon to carry ammunition and tools. All that manpower, all that prep time, all that equipage, just to produce a substantial amount of casualties in the field under the most ideal conditions. And still, these were the weapons that all the Founding Fathers agreed were too dangerous and too deadly for personal use to acquire property and obtain safety. Now, let's put ourselves in the heads of our 18th century American ancestors. The ones whose original intent we honor so highly when it comes to interpreting the Second Amendment and the rest of the Constitution. We've just established the level of awe and respect they had for even the level of firepower their now antiquated artillery weapons could bring to the table. So imagine how the Founding Fathers would react if we took one of their contemporary 5-person artillery crews and outfitted each one of those men with a modern, street-legal, semi-automatic rifle, like, for example, a Bushmaster XM15. Even without an accessory like a bump stock, and no other modifications, per its manual, even this less-than-state-of-the-art semi-automatic rifle is capable of firing 45 rounds per minute. The U.S. Marine Corps Weapons Training Manual, Fundamental Techniques of Fire, describes suppressive fire, that is, the kind of firepower best suited to render an enemy force ineffective, as 12 to 15 rounds per minute, with the same caliber ammunition used by the Bushmaster. The Bushmaster has a maximum effective range of 600+ yards. Our 6-pounder cannon at that range will only hit targeted infantry less than 60% of the time. This rifle is about 1/100th of the weight of a 6-pounder cannon. It needs no horse team, it generates far less recoil, a shooter can direct fire in a wide arc and potentially cover many moving targets. And it produces no blooming clouds of smoke to interfere with aim. In the same space of time, a founding-era artillery crew could fire off 1 round of case shot. An equivalent 5-member fire team equipped with Bushmaster XM15s could deliver a staggering 112.5 rounds. Now remember, rifle-bearing infantrymen of George Washington and Napoleon's time had to deploy in very close, organized ranks in order to make their relatively inaccurate and only semi-reliable firearms effective. That's the main reason cannon with K-shot could cause so many casualties with one single round. Those enemy targets, marching or standing still in close ranks with little or no cover, would be sitting ducks to our Bushmaster-equipped fire team. Five independent, fast-moving shooters enfiladiing those targets from multiple angles with 112.5 rounds over 30 seconds. Can there be any real question that they would inflict far more than 25 casualties? Even if only 1 in 4 rounds hit a target, that works out to 28 casualties. Here's what we've just demonstrated. Pound for pound, modern semi-automatic weapons are actually more deadly than the military artillery known by the generation that wrote and ratified the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. And remember, we have all kinds of documentation that clearly shows early Americans did not individually keep and bear artillery weapons, not for personal use, not to employ as a check on the power of the federal government. The upshot here is a great many Americans just have the Second Amendment wrong from top to bottom. Weapons that a lot of people like to call assault rifles are simply not lineal descendants of the kinds of weapons early Americans used for self-defense and hunting. Because of what we've seen about artillery here, it turns out that the more you claim to honor and respect the original intent of the Founding Fathers, the less the Constitution should extend protection for the individual use of weapons like the Bushmaster or any other firearm in its class.
I already know what a lot of you are asking. You're asking, but what about privateers?
Privateers were ships that were fitted out and armed for naval combat at private expense. In January 1776, the official American Navy fleet was just 8 vessels with a combined 110 guns. But Americans were going up against the globe's predominant sea power. Americans were fighting a hot war. Some of our best shipbuilding ports were under British occupation, and our country was absolutely cash-strapped. There was no way to quickly and easily scale up the Navy. So civilian fishing, cargo, and passenger ships, and even whaling boats, were turned into fighting vessels. And these usually privately operated and privately owned fighting vessels most definitely carried and used artillery pieces like cannon.
So, does this mean that the right to keep and bear arms that the Second Amendment references is meant to include military-grade weapons? In one representative and much clicked on YouTube video commenting on this very issue, internet personality Steven Crowder says yes.
And the Second Amendment didn't just apply to guns, but full-on artillery. Here's a letter of marque and reprisal signed by President Madison for a privately owned ship carrying cannons that was authorized to attack enemy shipping. These were not muskets, and the Founding Fathers didn't give no craps.
But the so-called evidence that Mr. Crowder presents here in support of his claim actually makes the exact opposite point.
It thoroughly sabotages his own argument about the Second Amendment. Letters of marque and reprisal, which only the U.S. federal government can furnish under the Constitution's Article 1, Section 8, were required for privateers to legally operate. In effect, letters of marque and reprisal were federally issued licenses allowing the temporary use of military-grade weapons. And even then, only in pursuit of wartime ends, and only during wartime. And this private artillery was being used not where American citizens actually lived, and where the jurisdiction of American law could reach, but on battlefields, offshore, often in international or enemy waters.
So no, if it requires a hand-signed letter of marque and reprisal from the president, you do not have the right to keep and bear military-grade weapons. If you need permission from someone in the government to keep and bear those military-grade weapons, then you are not exercising a right. You are exercising a privilege.
This dynamic, self-defense weapons for individuals, scaling up by necessity with military weapons for militias and standing armies, is the dynamic the Second Amendment is concerned with. All of this, by the way, isn't my personal opinion. It's exactly what Ronald Reagan-appointed conservative, originalist Justice Antonin Scalia cemented as Supreme Court precedent in the landmark Second Amendment case, District of Columbia v. Heller.
Look, if you feel like you need military-grade weapons for self-defense, then you're not living in a state of society. You're living in what the Founding Fathers called a state of war with your neighbors.
The entire philosophical underpinning of the American concept of government is that human beings find it unacceptable to live in a state of war, in a constant state of physical insecurity, where anyone stronger or better armed than you can prey at will upon you and your property. So we delegate away a certain amount of our pure, untrammeled freedom in order to increase our safety and security. Actively deciding to live not in a state of war, but in a state of society is the whole reason to establish government in the first place. So including military-grade weapons for self-protection isn't just at odds with the Second Amendment, it's at odds with the entire concept of the United States Constitution. Even in colonial times, frontiersmen facing hostile Indians and foreign invaders like the French had the expectation that their government would help protect them. Being safe and secure was, they felt, their right for choosing to live in a state of society. Americans were not staking it all on some every man for himself libertarian fantasy. Even the frontiersmen had the expectation that every citizen of the state would contribute time, energy, and money to help protect the whole. That is the essence of the colonial and revolutionary militia. And this was true whether you were living in the relative safety of a port city on the coast or defending some homestead deep in the wilderness of the interior. It's important to touch on two other principles that restrict the individual right to keep and bear arms. The individual right to keep and bear arms is also limited by where you keep and bear those arms. The right is at its highest level of protection in the place where the need to defend yourself, your family, and your property is most acute. In the home. The farther you go from home, the more government has the authority to place restrictions on that right. To put this another way, the people of a state might decide, through their elected representatives, that allowing individuals to walk around armed with weapons constitutes more of a threat to life and property than not allowing them to. And even the highly conservative late Supreme Court Justice, Antonin Scalia, recognized the government has an even greater authority to restrict the Second Amendment in what he called sensitive places, such as schools and government buildings. You think regulations against concealed carry are the handiwork of modern liberals? Think again. Kentucky and Louisiana in 1813, Indiana in 1820, Georgia in 1837, Tennessee, Virginia, and Arkansas in 1838, and Alabama in 1839 all passed state laws to limit the right to go around in public with concealed weapons. The 1876 Texas Constitution states, "The legislature shall have the power by law to regulate the wearing of arms with a view to prevent crime." Finally, it's a good idea to take another close look at the language of the Second Amendment to see how another important set of restrictions on the right can come to exist. Even people who consider themselves pretty well versed on the Constitution often haven't thought about it this way, so this is eye-opening for a large number of people. A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state. The right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Here's the word to pay attention to in this instance: people. In the Constitution, the word people has a very different meaning from the word persons. And key Second Amendment court cases have in fact turned on this distinction. Persons means every single human being, period. People indicates a smaller, more exclusive group. People is that part of the population that is actually empowered to vote, to hold political office, to serve on juries, and to serve in the militia. Anyone who knows anything about American history knows that in 1787, when the Constitution was written, these political rights were pretty much reserved only to white male property owners. Slaves, children, women, Native Americans, prisoners, indigents, indentured servants, non-citizen aliens, and the severely mentally ill or mentally challenged all had highly restricted political rights, if they had them at all, and many of those classes didn't have them at all. Once you understand this difference, you see it all over the Constitution. For example, those who wrote the Constitution famously tap danced around ever having to mention slavery or slaves by name. So they employed the catch-all term persons. For example, Article 1, Section 9, Paragraph 1. The migration or importation of such persons, as any of the states now existing shall think proper to admit, shall not be prohibited by the Congress prior to the year 1808. This clause is about the importation of slaves. It wasn't we the persons who instituted our republican form of government, it was we the people. There were great injustices initially implicit in this people/person system. But over time, those have been rectified to debatable degrees. The question of just who gets included in the people has expanded. And when these expansions have happened at the national level, they have required constitutional amendments or acts of Congress each time. States have also passed laws to include or exclude certain classes from the people. For example, in most states like New York, Texas, California, Florida, Washington, and Alaska, those who are convicted of felonies and who are either behind bars or on parole or probation are legally stripped of the right to vote. Their status as members of the people has been taken away or put on hold. Going back to the language of the Second Amendment's inner bubble, we are now ready to see it clearly for what it is. Now, two critical things can be understood. Number one, that the Second Amendment protections do not belong to every living and breathing man, woman, and child. Those protections belong only to those whose political rights are recognized. In other words, they belong to the law-abiding, sane, mature, competent adults who make up the people. Number two, government has at least some limited authority to democratically determine to whom these Second Amendment rights reach. It's well within the scope of government, both at the state and federal level, to regulate gun purchases by the mentally ill, the mentally incompetent, and those under restraining orders for domestic violence or harassment. But let's say you are one of those law-abiding, sane, competent adults. Then congratulations, because you have been right all along. No government actor, not at the state level, not at the federal level, has the rightful power under the Constitution to take away your handgun, shotgun, or rifle, the firearms that you used to hunt with, or to protect yourself and your property in the home. By now, we have analyzed the heck out of the inner bubble, the smaller and more constrained individual right to keep and bear arms. We haven't had a lot of discussion about the outer bubble, the collective right to keep and bear arms, what the two bubbles have to do with each other, how they relate, and why specifically the man who drafted the Second Amendment, James Madison, the man who would become the fourth president of the United States, arranged the operative and prefatory clauses with that excruciating passive voice awkwardness that often makes the Second Amendment so resistant to understanding. There were, in fact, highly explicit reasons why James Madison thought it would be good to stitch together the idea of the citizens' militia with the idea of the right to keep and bear arms. And Madison's reasons have very little to do with high statesmanship or grand philosophical pronouncements. In fact, they have a lot to do with some canny political sleight of hand in order to win a rural Virginia congressional election in 1789. But first, a more pressing matter: the militia, and getting to a clear and constitutionally sound understanding of what it is, what its purpose is, and what classes of arms it can employ for what lawful purposes. We mentioned very briefly before that the people have a collective right to defend themselves and their local governments in times of public danger. The militia is the instrument through which the people exercise that collective right. And remember, the people entails only those who are empowered with political rights. The Constitution explicitly mentions 4 public danger situations where the militia may possibly get involved: to suppress insurrections, to repel invasions, in times of war, or if, at the direction of Congress, federal law is not being executed. A primary role of the militia, then, the Constitution demonstrates, is to aid the federal government. And in fact, none other than George Washington called up the militias of Virginia, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and Maryland to put down the so-called Whiskey Rebellion in 1794. The Whiskey Rebellion was an uprising against federal excise tax collection that took place in the region of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, but was spreading to frontier areas of nearby states. Commanding those militias in the field were their 4 respective state governors. This happened to include Virginia Governor and Revolutionary War hero Henry Lighthorse Lee, the father of Robert E. Lee. So, some of the earliest precedent we have of militia activity since U.S. nationhood is of the militia aiding the federal government. But when the militia is discussed publicly nowadays, it is very nearly always in the context of taking up arms against the federal government in order to oppose what James Madison called ambitious encroachments, or projects or enterprises of ambition. Many Americans lately have become mesmerized with the wholly ahistorical and mistaken idea that individuals, or ad hoc groups of individuals, are the rightful and intended bulwarks against federal government tyranny. They are worried, if not to say obsessed, by the possibility that power elites in Washington will summarily dissolve our representational form of government and employ the U.S. military or other forces to subjugate the American people and hold them in some kind of dictatorship or slavery.
The right to bear arms in defense of our
These individuals see themselves as constituent members of the militia. They claim that it falls under the Second Amendment's collective right for them to have access to weapons of war. In other words, they understand the right to keep and bear arms to encompass an individual right to own military-grade weapons, which would be required in the event of taking offensive or defensive action against the government. A number of public figures have endorsed this opinion.
The Second Amendment was not written to protect your right to shoot skeet or to protect your right to shoot deer. It was written to protect your right to shoot the bad guys when the police can't or won't. And, this is a hard and difficult truth, it was written to protect your right to shoot tyrants when they take over the government.
Our founding fathers wanted every citizen to be armed equal to the army in case of takeover by a tyrannical government. They wanted us to have protection from them.
Also, if we have a time when we have the wrong people in office and they want to dominate the people will be able to defend themselves. As Daniel Webster eloquently said, the people of America will never suffer under tyranny because they are armed.
Second Amendment. What I haven't heard is one coherent reason why any civilian in America needs an AR-15 military-style assault weapon. Tell me why you need one.
To protect against the possibility of eventual government tyranny. This was the purpose of the Second Amendment originally. It remains the purpose of the Second Amendment now.
A free state is what the framers wanted America to be. They saw an armed citizenry as in part a hedge against tyranny.
Full-page newspaper ads produced by the NRA have placed a similar, distorting emphasis on the Second Amendment, accentuating the role of individual Americans to have firearms at the ready when dictators send troops to come crush their freedoms.
The problem here isn't that these people, let's call them militiaists, are wrong exactly. The problem is that their conception of the militia is so comically and self-servingly simplistic. What most of the militiaists understand about the Second Amendment and what they take away from a very narrowly curated body of Founding Father quotes is 2 things. 1, that the militia is supposed to have a role in preventing a tyrannical government from seizing power. And 2, that the militia consists of every able-bodied adult citizen, the whole of the people. That's as far as the thinking of the militiaists tends to go. But to get a clear look of what's really going on, you need to go a lot farther than that.
Here's what the oversimplifying militiaists almost universally fail to acknowledge. The Founding Fathers never saw the militia as individuals or groups of individuals organizing and acting on their own sovereign authority or at their own initiative. Again, James Madison, in strikingly plain pro-individual right language, from The Federalist, number 46.
Besides the advantage of being armed, which the Americans possess over the people of almost every other nation, the existence of subordinate governments to which the people are attached and by which the militia officers are appointed forms a barrier against the enterprises of ambition, more insurmountable than any which a simple government of any form can admit of.
The militia was always to be organized by and to be under the strict command of either the governments of the states or, though certainly not in the exigencies of a rising up against tyranny context, the President of the United States, the Commander-in-Chief. That's not all. The Constitution, in Article 1, Section 8, specifies that Congress has the power to organize, arm, and discipline the militia. Congress is additionally empowered to govern the militia when it, or any part of it, has been called up for federal duty. The inclusion of these congressional militia powers is one of the reasons the Second Amendment came about. But once again, that's part of the story we're getting to, of James Madison's bid to be elected to Congress in 1789. And yet pro-gun ideologues seem to believe congressional oversight of the militia was effectively repealed by the Second Amendment. Nothing could be further from the truth. In fact, constitutional oversight of the militia by the President and the Congress was 100% reaffirmed with the 1792 Federal Militia Acts. Those were passed a year after the ratification of the Second Amendment. Either way, militia members were always to be subject to higher civilian authority, even under the most extreme circumstances, when the people's right of revolution is invoked. Without being duly constituted under and overseen by an elected civilian authority, the Founding Fathers would have considered armed groups using force at their own will to be dangerous, anarchic vigilantes. Insurgents, to use George Washington's own words. The difference between a true state militia and an armed combination calling itself one is the same as the difference that exists between a sworn jury in a court on the one hand and a lynch mob on the other. The state of Delaware's 1796 supplement to its laws establishing the state militia sums this up nicely. The assembling of large bodies of armed men who do not acknowledge and refuse to submit to the legal military establishment is highly improper, inasmuch as it is dangerous to the liberties of the people. To get a sense of just how much the militia was always meant to be shaped by legislation and by politicians representing the sovereign people, all we need to do is take a step that the militiaists almost never take themselves, and that is to examine the body of state laws that were written to govern the militia after the Second Amendment was ratified. Let's examine the Constitution and laws not of some northern state with a reputation for big government like Massachusetts or New York. Let's look at the state constitution of Georgia. Georgia's 1798 Constitution was written in the same decade as the Second Amendment. This was still a time when the Founding Fathers and the revolutionary generation were still very much alive, at the height of their power, and consolidating their original intent into the young republic's laws, political norms, legal precedents, and governing documents. Georgia's Constitution designated the elected state governor as commander-in-chief of the militia. That means to the governor was delegated the power to call up the militia or to order it to stand down. And this wasn't the case only with Georgia's post-Bill of Rights state constitution. Every state constitution in the Union, then and in a practice that endures right up to modern times, stipulates the same exact thing. The elected governors are commanders-in-chief of the militia. South Carolina's state constitution points out that the governor's sphere of command includes even the disorganized militia. Georgia's period constitution and state militia laws reveal that the militia was anything but a libertarian institution created to establish and sustain a leave-us-alone relationship between individuals and their government. Militia members were required by law to appear in person at general musters and all other necessary occasions. They were enjoined to perform the whole duty of a militia man, even if they hadn't been given any prior notice. Georgia militia members who failed to appear for militia service, who disobeyed the orders of their state-appointed militia officers, or exhibited ungentlemanlike behavior, faced fines. If they didn't pay the fines, they could be committed to the common jail of the county without bail. Oh, and if they wanted to appeal the charges, they couldn't do so in a civilian court. Militia members were subject to courts-martial. That means they weren't to be subject to the judgment of a jury of their peers. They were subject to the judgment of their militia's commissioned officers.
I've often heard it said from those who are opposed to gun control that government should be prevented from knowing what individuals actually possess firearms. But Georgia's 1792 militia laws, passed a year after the Second Amendment was ratified, dictate the exact opposite.
The commanding officer of each company of militia shall enroll the names of all the male inhabitants, slaves excepted, above the age of 18 and under the age of 45 years. It is very much the business of the commander-in-chief of the state to know just who is in the militia. Information which includes who possesses firearms.
In the state of Delaware, which was one of the original 13 states, and below the Mason-Dixon line on top of that, the practice of keeping track of who owned firearms went an even greater distance. That's because in Delaware, it was codified state law that lists of militia members plus what guns and ammunition they individually kept under their roofs were all to be forwarded to the federal government.
So let's hold up here for a moment. And let's recap the many, many ways that being a member of the militia is not a way of confronting government power, but, according to the Founding Fathers, a deeper and further way of being integrated with government power. Because after all, that government power is one the people chose and, in fact, created for themselves. The state governments, through both elected political leaders on the one hand and appointed militia officers on the other, had the power to compel militia members to physically show up in certain places at certain times. They could obligate you to perform the duties government authorities, like the governor, assigned you. With the enforcements to act in a soldierly and gentlemanlike manner, the state governments could literally dictate how you were to behave. Even after a Georgia militia member was discharged from militia duty, it was a punishable offense for him in his civilian life to threaten or insult his superior officers. Militia authorities could inform the governors and even the U.S. president about what guns and ammunition you own. They could separate you from your property and even from your freedom if you didn't comply. And guess what else? Civilian and military leadership, through due process, were also empowered to disqualify certain people from militia service in the first place.
In Georgia, members of the Quaker faith were exempt from being members of the militia. And that same body of Georgia state militia laws, codified by the sovereign people of that state, didn't stop there. It exempted a large number of other people, too. It exempted the old, the young, and a large number of men who were performing certain duties in society. For example, ministers, judges, ferrymen, students, millers, tutors, and county surveyors were all made by law legally exempt from performing their political right to be members of the state militia.
More importantly, for the purposes of common sense modern gun laws, Georgia recognized that there were those in society simply not fit to be members of the militia, because, for physical or mental reasons, those members of society were dangers to themselves or others. Invalids, madmen, imbeciles, and idiots are all specified in Georgia's 1792 militia laws as having no rights to be considered members of the militia. Invalids, madmen, imbeciles, and idiots, in other words, were adjudicated by the citizens of Second Amendment-era Georgia to not rank as full, legitimate members of the people with all the rights that entails. That means no Second Amendment rights. Not qualifying for militia service, madmen and so on could have no legal access to the deadliest weapons of the period, artillery. And as we are now outfitted with the knowledge that modern semi-automatic weapons are more destructive than the artillery the militias of the 1790s and beyond had, there is no question of the legitimacy of state governments acting to ban AR-15s and the like from those suffering mental illness or incapacity or violent antisocial tendencies.
So what does this mean? It means that the Americans, who are the contemporaries of the Second Amendment era, had the common sense to take steps to prevent military-grade weapons from falling into the hands of those who would use those weapons to commit criminal harm upon society. We should honor the Second Amendment's original generation by taking steps to do the same thing.
Remember what we referred to as the oversimplified talking points of the so-called militiaists? They like to claim that the militia includes every able-bodied adult, or the whole of the people. But even in 1790s Georgia, a place as pristine to the American way of gun ownership and the purest possible living age of the original intent of the Second Amendment, we see what an oversimplification this is. All kinds of people, for all kinds of reasons, were kept out of the militia. The belief that the militia right was a limited one was not exclusive to the state governments of places like Georgia and South Carolina. This presumption was echoed from all over the Union in the halls of the U.S. Congress as they debated the 1792 Militia Act. I very much disapprove of the idea of making a soldier of every man between 18 and 45 years of age. There is a manifest impropriety in the measure. Elias Boudinot, congressman from Massachusetts. Many characters in society cannot and ought not to be compelled to bear arms. Jeremiah Smith, congressman from New Hampshire. What about the militiaists' other oversimplification? The one about the militia's role in overthrowing the federal government if it becomes tyrannical. In the scenario where the federal government becomes despotic, it is the state governments who are to act, not the ranks of everyday American militia members acting on their own impulses. The state governments are the only ones authorized to carry out the fallback position of overthrowing the federal government by force. By now, it should be perfectly clear to see what the Founding Fathers' original intent was on this point. We've seen it confirmed by early Supreme Court justices. We've heard it straight from the mouth of James Madison.
Besides the advantage of being armed, which the Americans possess over the people of almost every other nation, the existence of subordinate governments to which the people are attached and by which the militia officers are appointed forms a barrier against the enterprises of ambition, more insurmountable than any which a simple government of any form can admit of.
The subordinate governments Madison is talking about, the ones the people are attached to, those are the states. The advantage of the armed people is not simply that they have weapons, but that they are organized and commanded by elected and appointed leaders. Men of experience who can be trusted not to use force in ways that would be harmful to Americans' Republican values. Founding Father Alexander Hamilton echoes the exact same doctrine. The state legislatures will always be not only vigilant, but suspicious and jealous guardians of the rights of the citizens, and will constantly have their attention awake to the conduct of the national rulers, and will be ready enough, if anything improper appears, to sound the alarm to the people, and not only to be the voice, but, if necessary, the arm of their discontent. But far and away, the best proof we have that it is the states who are the proper bulwark against federal government tyranny are right there in the words of the Second Amendment itself. A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state.
Law professor Eugene Volokh, in a popular Second Amendment video explainer that he hosted, makes the claim that state here means nation state.
In the 1790s, the phrase free state wasn't used to mean an individual state like New York or Rhode Island. Rather, it meant what we'd call today a free country, a nation free of despotism. A free state is what the framers wanted America to be. They saw an armed citizenry as in part a hedge against tyranny.
In other words, as Volokh would have it, the Second Amendment is expressing something about America in general, and not specifically about its constituent members, the states. But consider that in the Constitution, the word state is used over 200 times as the document stood immediately after the ratification of the Bill of Rights. And not in one of those other instances does the word state ever mean America as a whole or just some country in general. The word state in the Constitution on its own means one of the states, like Maryland, North Carolina, or Rhode Island. And it only makes sense that the Second Amendment's prefatory clause is talking about the state governments because those are the entities that have militias. No other entity enjoys the constitutional prerogative of having a militia. The prefatory clause is about the states. It also makes no sense that the Second Amendment would be talking in abstract general terms about good government for free men anywhere in the world, because the whole Bill of Rights is only about domestic issues in the United States. The other provisions of the Bill of Rights get into the nitty-gritty of things like warrants and bail and double jeopardy in lawsuits and witness testimony. The Second Amendment is not part of the Constitution that poetically spouts off about abstract ideas of good government.
Yet another piece of evidence cutting against Volokh and like-minded militiaists is the fact that James Madison originally chose the words free country, not free state, in his first draft of what became the Second Amendment. That language, however, was specifically and intentionally changed to free state. And it was done so before the amendments were even submitted to the rest of Congress to discuss and debate them, as they did in August 1789. Going back in time, straight to the source of the Founding Fathers' original intent, we see what were really meant to be the prime preservers of liberty. The structural institutions of the constitutional republic. Separation of powers, elections, an independent judiciary, civil control over military coerciveness, and separate spheres of influence for local and central authorities. The Founding Fathers did not see some overhanging, ever-present threat of force by ungoverned armed gangs as a firewall against tyranny. The Founding Fathers never contemplated their enlightened form of government under the Constitution as one compatible with individuals who cannot tolerate being under the jurisdiction of even local state governments designed to be most responsive to the people. There would be nothing more alien and outlandish to the Founding Fathers than the phenomenon of the so-called sovereign citizen. This brings us back to the way we should be thinking about the Second Amendment and the individual versus collective rights to bear arms. That is, as a bubble inside a bubble. Two separate and coexisting rights working together and enabling each other. The Founding Fathers did believe that it was a big advantage for those in the United States, those with recognized political rights, to be armed with and competent in the use of the handguns, shotguns, and rifles they kept to acquire and protect property and safety. Now, why is that? For one, these skills and responsibilities are the bare minimum required to render effective militia service. Whether that service is repelling an invasion, suppressing an insurrection, aiding in the execution of U.S. or local law, or theoretically countering a federal government that has somehow become despotic. The keeping and using of firearms is the bare essential ingredient, the foundation of the ability to deal out the coercive force of government when it's necessary and when it's legal to do so.
That's what we start with. That's what makes the individual right to use firearms the inner bubble. But we the people who just happen to possess shotguns, rifles, and handguns are not the equivalent of a well-regulated militia. It actually requires a great deal more skills, training, experience, and oversight to secure a state, and not just an individual, a homestead, or a small settlement.
Well-regulated essentially means trained and disciplined. Militiamen who take part in military exercises, who receive from their officers training and discipline at regular intervals over a period of time, become well-regulated, practiced. And training and discipline at the direction of militia officers takes the basic skills of firearms for self-defense and home defense and augments those basic skills into the wider expertise required for soldiering, without being drilled in the highly specific maneuvers allowing them to become an effective fighting force in the field. Armed militiamen would be just a bunch of uncoordinated yahoos with guns. George Washington reported this firsthand in 1776. To place any dependence upon militia is assuredly resting upon a broken staff. Men just dragged from the tender scenes of domestic life, unaccustomed to the din of arms, totally unacquainted with every kind of military skill, which, being followed by a want of confidence in themselves, when opposed to troops regularly trained, disciplined, and appointed, superior in knowledge and superior in arms, makes them timid and ready to fly from their own shadows. An effective fighting force like George Washington yearned for needs more unsexy but necessary skills than simple marksmanship and weapon maintenance. Skills like maneuvering and firing, signals operations, camp making, camp sanitation, force protection, supply and logistics, and military engineering for things like defensive works and bridges. Sustained exposure to actual combat was often felt to be the best way to hone those skills. But in the absence of the wisdom that accrues only to hardened veterans, training and discipline were, all the Founding Fathers felt, indispensable.
Those who are still attached to the romance and oversimplification of the Second Amendment might ask, but did the Founding Fathers actually say this themselves? Yes, they did. The emphasis on the militia being a way to pass on military knowledge is all over their early debates in Congress.
The intention of making the youth perform double-duty militia service was that they might speedily be taught the military art and be enabled to defend their country if her situation called for their aid. James Madison. The first principle of the security of the United States must rest and consist in a hardy militia, exercised in large bodies with their officers for a time not less than 12 nor more than 20 days, in which period all the general principles of war should be industriously practiced. General Henry Knox. We must train and classify the whole of our male citizens and make military instruction a regular part of collegiate education. We can never be safe till this is done. Thomas Jefferson. And of course, an effective militia force scaled up to ensure the security of one of the American states also requires scaled-up weapons.
That's why, for we the people, it's only when we're acting in our collective capacity, when constituted as a well-regulated militia, that there's anything like a historical or legal precedent for training with and using weapons as deadly as military-grade weapons.
artillery, or the modern categorical equivalent of the so-called assault rifles. A small company of artillerists may compose a part of every militia brigade. Each state should form an arsenal and furnish it with military stores and apparatus adequate to the equipment of its whole trained band. Quartermaster General and later Secretary of State and Secretary of War, Timothy Pickering. And the well-regulated militia, exercising its collective right to bear military-grade weapons, is the outer bubble. The outer bubble is built upon the foundation of the inner bubble. You can't have the well-regulated militia without the individual citizens trained with firearms. And the individual citizens can't, together, be secured without the overarching military might of the state. The well-regulated militia, with its greater armaments, is in turn the much stronger coercive force required to protect and sustain not individuals or homesteads, but to repel existential threats to the survival of the entire American system of free government itself. Because think, if the government of a state or the United States is threatened and crushed by invasion or insurrection or tyranny, then there would be no government left to protect the property and the individual rights and liberties that the United States government was established to protect in the first place. If you need military-grade weapons to defend yourself and your property, then you are living in a state of war. And that subverts everything the Constitution, everything that civilization is about. Remember, though, that the system of a citizen militia, subordinate to local civil authority, and the individual right to keep non-military firearms both pre-exist the Second Amendment. Neither the 1787 Constitution nor the amendments that came in 1791 were required to establish either of those things. In fact, you might say that the Second Amendment really does nothing more than restate, or just put in writing, some ideas that were already long-time standing practices, traditions, and values of American society. So let's finally answer this question. Why do we have a Second Amendment? What led James Madison to put those words in that precise order is rooted in a school of thought that ran through centuries of power struggles in the English-speaking world, as well as the American Revolution. To be as succinct as possible about it, let's boil down the reason the United States ever became an independent country to this: that a substantially large group of Englishmen had a problem with their king abusing their rights and freedoms. By this I mean many of the American colonists in the years leading up to 1776. What you may not know, though, is that for Americans in the 1700s, a script already existed for how to think about and what to do about problematic kings and the abuses of rights. The American Revolution was certainly a tumultuous time, but so was 1600s England, a time rife with deadly Protestant versus Catholic intrigue, succession feuds, ethnic and interdenominational warfare, and intense clashes between the powers of the monarch versus the powers of the Parliament. Parliament, of course, was the representatives of English freemen, the we the people of that country, if you will, those with property and political rights. Now, the United States Constitution is a written document, but you can also think about a constitution simply as the way a society is put together or is constituted in a way that keeps it at least relatively stable. King Charles I, Charles II, and James II all had influential detractors who felt the kings had committed authoritarian-style violations against the English Constitution. Chief among these violations included levying taxes in the same taxation without representation style Americans would start calling to account in the next century. Much of those 17th century unjust taxes were to wage wars and increase the power of the army. And how did these critics of absolutist monarchical power see the king's army? As a corrupt institution with the monarch's toadies and political favorites at the top, and the unpropertied and thuggish dregs of society forced to fill out the low ranks. In other words, to any middling man of property, the army was a two-pronged threat. These middling men of property much preferred the militia that they were officers in and had some control over. James II was Catholic and was to a great degree vilified by his majority Protestant subjects. So Catholic James II especially used his army to protect himself from his subjects. He caused an uproar by deciding to make the army a standing army. That is, one that remained in service even in peacetime. And James put troops out among the people, in many cases quartering or accommodating soldiers in private homes. James II also continued his brother Charles II's practice of issuing royal proclamations to disarm his enemies. There's no real evidence mass disarmaments were ever carried out in England, but plenty of English lords and gentlemen did not like such policies. Charles I, he was beheaded. James II's enemies invited a Protestant Dutch prince to invade England, and when James consequently fled to France, Parliament decided he had abdicated the throne. Holland-born William of Orange became the new monarch of England. Under William, England adopted a written Bill of Rights with new limitations on keeping standing armies and limitations on the power to disarm Protestant subjects. Now, flash forward to the American Revolution. The king is new, George III. The critics of the king are new, the American independence movement. But we find that many of the grievances against the king are not new. Some are basically cut and paste from the 1680s. Dissolving legislatures, levying taxes not approved by the people's representatives, rendering the military superior to the civil power, quartering troops among the people in a time of peace. Plus, during the war for their independence, Revolutionary-era Americans mostly faced two kinds of enemy fighters. The professional military regulars of Great Britain and the bought and paid for Hessian auxiliaries from the German states. The rank and file of these enemy fighting forces were from the lowest classes of their societies. They exercised no control over where they were sent to fight, against who or why. The Hessians especially, who were basically mercenaries, were not participants in an enlightened system of free men. They were incentivized to wage war because war was their bread and butter. Americans did not want things this way in their civilization. So the colonists reacted by echoing the ready-made, pro-militia, anti-standing army rhetoric of their forefathers under the Stuart monarchs like James II. The Americans who desired to live under a new and more just form of government adhered strictly and passionately to the idea that a militia of citizen soldiers was the best peacetime defense for a republic.
And just as importantly, the Second Amendment upholds the ideal that soldiers be citizen soldiers, not separate from the rest of the people, but who in fact are meant to have peaceful and prosperous lives as civilians themselves. Members of the militia were to be revered because of their stakes in and ties to the people around them. Americans of the Revolutionary period deeply felt that those who had a lot to lose at home would be much less likely to gamble their lives and their property with military adventures abroad. And this preference for a citizen's militia over a standing army is, in fact, the main reason why we have a Second Amendment. But the doctrine of militia supremacy was a philosophical ideal to these patriots of 1776. It was theory, it was ideology, and it was good politics for certain people to speak about and write about the militia this way for the benefit of like-minded followers. But in practice, as a national security response, militia came with big problems. Problems that many founding fathers, particularly the ones who had actually seen combat in the Revolutionary War, could, by the 1790s, no longer ignore.
Militiamen had earned glorious victories at the battles of Bunker Hill and Lexington and Concord in 1775. But as time went on, they racked up a number of chilling embarrassments. The Revolutionary War had proved itself only winnable by establishing a central, professionalized Continental Army, the direct descendant of our contemporary army. And a military resolution of the War for Independence was only clinched with the aid of the military of France. King Louis XVI's fighting forces were, of course, a European-style one, composed of aristocratic officers and low-born peasant cannon fodder. Exactly the kind of standing army freedom-loving Englishmen and Americans were supposed to loathe. After the war, in 1786, American militiamen themselves took the sides of armed insurgents in the Shays' Rebellion of Western Massachusetts, a local and national crisis for the United States. In 1791, militiamen on a mission against Miami and Shawnee Indians in Ohio deserted in large numbers while on the march through the wilderness. And when they were attacked by the native warriors, the militia fled without their weapons. The result was a rout and a major defeat in the fledgling country's attempt to secure its western frontier. And then during the Whiskey Rebellion, militiamen had been among the leaders of the uprising. It had been a painful political minefield for Washington to raise militia troops from surrounding states. Even then, the ranks had been filled out not with brave, upstanding citizen soldiers, but with poor quality, paid substitutes lacking discipline and soldiering skills. The truth was, war and civilian life had both changed radically since the medieval or feudal era that the militia ideology had sprung from. War, on one hand, and agriculture and commerce, on the other, had grown so sophisticated that full-time professionals with plenty of training and knowledge were required for both. Capitalism is the economic theory that would eventually allow the United States to become a global superpower. And the undisputed father of modern capitalism, Adam Smith, believed it was a fallacy that enlightened men of this new age could specialize both as soldiers and as professional participants in a capitalist system. In 1776, he wrote, "A well-regulated standing army is superior to every militia. It is only by means of a standing army that the civilization of any country can be perpetuated or even preserved for any considerable time." Not a few of our founding fathers were inclined to agree with this, but even those who supported ideas like Adam Smith's knew too many Americans were too deeply attached to the nostalgia and romance of bygone, simpler times. They would never agree to a professional army taking the place of the militia. Forward-looking founding fathers wrestled with this conundrum, both as they drafted the U.S. Constitution and exerted themselves to form the military policy of the early republic. They decided to try to split the difference. They would compromise by forming a national militia. The national militia proponents wanted to make sure that it would be the federal government taking the initiative to set down how the militias would be organized and armed. They were weary and nervous that if the whole matter was left to the individual states, the militias would be uneven at best, utterly neglected at worst, and the brand new nation would crumble to either exterior threats or interior chaos. The struggle to split the difference between the professional standing army that many Americans would not tolerate and the ideal of the citizens' militia is why the Constitution delegates so much power to Congress to organize, arm, discipline, and govern the militia. Remember now that the Constitution didn't just become the supreme law of the land when it was written. Every state that wanted to join the Union had to officially adopt or ratify it first. And the Constitution had enemies, generally called anti-federalists, who had resolved to either substantially alter the Constitution or keep their home states out of the Union altogether. The Anti-Federalists took a lot of issues with the document. That there wouldn't be jury trials for civil lawsuits. That it gave Congress a mode of taxing power that they didn't approve of. That Congress would have too much power over how elections are held in the states. That the Constitution didn't afford any protection from Congress granting monopolies. That members of the House of Representatives were not going to represent enough people in their districts. But the National Militia Plan, put forward by pro-Constitution figures like James Madison, George Washington, Henry Knox, Timothy Pickering, and Baron von Steuben, coupled with the power the Constitution delegated to Congress to raise armies and a navy in peacetime, was a flashing yellow warning signal to anti-federalists. The absolute command of Congress over the militia may be destructive of public liberty, for under the guidance of an arbitrary government, they may be made the unwilling instruments of tyranny. Suffer me, sir, to say a few words on the fatal effects of standing armies, that bane of Republican governments. Was it not with this that Caesar passed the Rubicon and laid prostrate the liberties of his country? Britain attempted to enforce her arbitrary measures by a standing army. A well-regulated militia, composed of the body of the people trained to arms, is the proper, natural, and safe defense of a free state. Standing armies in time of peace are dangerous to liberty, and therefore ought to be avoided, as far as circumstances and protection of the community will admit, and that in all cases, the military should be under strict subordination to and governed by the civil power. Now, there's a version of American history that the gun rights extremists love to propagate.
Of all man's works beneath the heavens, none shines brighter than our Constitution. I think Jefferson and Paine, Adams, Madison, Mason, Franklin. I think they're looking down right now at us. I think they understand what we're trying to do.
They want everyone to believe that the main reason anyone opposed the Constitution and wanted amendments or a Bill of Rights were because liberty-loving patriots were making a righteous stand over their access to firearms. But does that narrative of how the Second Amendment came about actually square with the facts? Let's recall that back in the late 1780s, when the Constitution was being voted up or down, there were just 13 states. Now, a respectable number of those states ratified the Constitution without any fuss at all. They didn't want any amendments. Those 5 states were Georgia, Pennsylvania, Connecticut, Delaware, and New Jersey. That leaves us with 8 states remaining. Now, all of those states eventually ratified the Constitution. It didn't come down to an ultimatum with any of them. But they did pass on lists of amendments that they were urging America to adopt. 2 of those states, South Carolina and Massachusetts, mentioned nothing in their proposals about a right to keep and bear arms or how we'd prefer citizens' militias over a standing army. So now that leaves us with a remainder of 6. And the issues that went into making the Second Amendment were not their top priority. When you tabulate the amendments that these 6 states actually proposed, a much clearer picture emerges of the kinds of changes some Americans of the founding period wanted to the United States Constitution. But issues of arms, issues of quartering troops in private homes, and of militias versus standing armies constituted only 3.2% of Maryland's proposals, 6.4% of New York's proposals, 6.8% of New Hampshire's, 10.1% of Rhode Island's, 12.9% of North Carolina's, and 14.3% of Virginia's. Of those 6 states that offered amendments in this grain at all, only 3 out of the total of 13, wanted the Constitution amended with a specific explicit right for the people to keep and bear arms. Those 3 states were New York, North Carolina, and Virginia. So, to the very limited extent that standing armies and a federal constitution recognized right to keep and bear arms was a priority among the men of the early republic, it was empirically most so in James Madison's home state. At the time the Constitution was being written and ratified, James Madison of Orange County, Virginia, was arguably George Washington's closest political ally and confidant. Yet once the government was actually set up, Washington was not able to favor Madison with any plum cabinet secretary appointments, like he did with Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson and Henry Knox. And Madison, who had been ardently in favor of the Constitution, had accrued some powerful and vociferous political enemies in Virginia, notably the Commonwealth's mighty anti-federalist governor, Patrick Henry. Possibly no one was as nostalgic and romantic about the bygone feudal days of the militia as Patrick Henry. And Henry had absolutely fulminated over the language in the Constitution meant to deliver a national militia. Let me here call your attention to that part, which gives the Congress power to provide for organizing, arming, and disciplining the militia, and for governing such part of them as may be employed in the service of the United States. You see that their control over our last and best defense is unlimited. If they neglect or refuse to discipline or arm our militia, they will be useless. The states can do neither, this power being exclusively given to Congress.
Patrick Henry was determined to make James Madison pay, both for drafting the Constitution the way he did and for undertaking such intense efforts to get it passed. But Madison truly wanted and expected to continue his reign as a political heavyweight. Though passed over for all the positions in George Washington's cabinet, it would have been natural for Madison to eye taking a place in that august higher body of Congress and becoming the senator from Virginia. But Governor Patrick Henry squeezed Madison out, making any bid for Madison to be in the U.S. Senate completely impossible. That left James Madison, the father of the Constitution and the man behind George Washington himself, to have to run for a seat in the U.S. House of Representatives like any other minor league political player. And Madison would have to campaign for that office in a district that had voted 8-5 against ratifying the Constitution that he had done so much to design. What's more, Madison would have to compete for that seat against a charismatic young war hero, James Monroe, a man with an anti-federalist bent and the full support of Governor Patrick Henry.
Dear Sir, the elections for the new government commenced shortly after my arrival here. It was my misfortune to be thrown into a contest with our friend, Colonel Monroe.
Remember, Virginia was one of the states that wanted amendments to the Constitution more than any other. It was one of the only 3 calling for a recognized right to keep and bear arms. The Constitution, to a real extent, was James Madison's baby. It did not especially suit him to have amendments or a Bill of Rights at all. He actually described the job of amending the Constitution as a nauseous project, but one that he was willing to undertake for political reasons.
The papers enclosed will show that the nauseous project of amendments has not yet been either dismissed or dispatched. In every government, power may oppress, and declarations on paper, though not an effectual restraint, are not without some influence. It is certainly best that the amendment should appear to be the free gift of the friends of the Constitution, rather than to be extorted by the address and weight of its enemies.
Madison could only get to be part of the government he did so much to form by by appealing to swing voters in his congressional district, especially religious minorities like Baptists. The Baptists wanted a freedom of religion amendment to the Constitution. A constituent wrote to Madison. He recommended that, to win the votes he desperately needed from the Baptists to beat James Monroe at the ballot box, Madison should make common cause with them. The Baptists, the preachers of that society, are much alarmed, fearing religious liberty is not sufficiently secured. They pretend to other objections, but that, I think, is the principal objection. Could that be removed by someone capable of the task, I think they would become friends to it. That body of people has become very formidable in point of elections.
It was anything but closely held and deeply felt philosophical principles that was motivating James Madison to push for amendments to the Constitution. We know by his own words that he certainly wasn't following some guiding star about an armed populace being the foundation of freedom and liberty. The main guiding star that James Madison was worried about at this point was winning that election. And by campaigning on a platform of being open to amendments to the Constitution, like the Virginia Baptists wanted, that proved to be a winning strategy. James Madison outfoxed Patrick Henry and beat James Monroe at the ballot box one icy night in February 1789, 1,308 votes to 972.
After taking up business as a sitting member of Congress, Madison owed the Orange County Baptists and his other constituents. And he also felt it was politically expedient to honor at least some of the changes the anti-federalist-leaning states had proposed. But in a letter to Thomas Jefferson, Madison characterized what we now refer to as the Bill of Rights, including the Second Amendment, as more or less harmless, conciliatory sacrifices. Sacrifices that would help stifle the voices of troublemakers who continue to demand more far-reaching changes to the Constitution.
With regard to the Constitution, it is pretty well decided that the disaffected party in the House does not exceed a very small minority. Notwithstanding this character of the body, I hope and expect that some conciliatory sacrifices will be made in order to extinguish opposition to the system, or at least break the force of it, by detaching the deluded opponents from their designing leaders.
What Madison truly feared was that an anti-federalist tide would deform the federal government's other powers, like how it would raise revenue. The language of what we know as the Second Amendment reaffirms what anti-federalists wanted to hear about the militia. But in point of fact, the Second Amendment is toothless to affect Congress's powers to arm, discipline, organize, and govern the militia. Madison had found a way to play both sides of the national militia issue.
By submitting his own list of amendments, Madison was actually throwing out most of what states like Virginia, New York, New Hampshire, Massachusetts, and North Carolina had proposed. And what Madison had actually drafted as a Bill of Rights, blanket statements about life, liberty, property, and popular sovereignty, those never made it into the Constitution at all. No one at the time, not Madison, not Jefferson, not Washington, not Adams, no one in Congress, no one in the newspapers referred to those first 10 amendments as a Bill of Rights. It wasn't until generations later that that name
for the first 10 amendments, including the Second Amendment, would ever be used in a case to come before the U.S. Supreme Court. Does that mean Amendments 1 through 10 mean nothing? No. In a way, it elevates them. Because Madison clearly thought these were values so deep and implicit in the American political spirit that putting them on paper wouldn't harm the bold experiment in founding a republic that Americans were embarking upon. What we know about the first 10 amendments should not make us idolize or fetishize them, but see them for what they are, part of, in line, and in harmony with the rest of the Constitution. A document inspired by Enlightenment ideas to separate humanity from the state of war and institute, under the rule of law, a regime better suited to justice, prosperity, and the safety and happiness of society. Absolutely key to this is the principle of the militia and the military being subordinate to civil authorities. We see the principle of the militia and the military being under the authority of the state governments in how the United States declared and fought for its independence.
When the American colonials were contemplating separating themselves from the British monarchy, they were desperate that the rest of the world not see them as impetuous, ungovernable upstarts acting without the sanction of any authority whatsoever.
American patriots didn't just pick up arms against the British. They held elections to form committees, assemblies, associations, and conventions. They sent representatives from their states to a continental Congress. They issued petitions to the king and Parliament. They sweated over the wording of proclamations and then voted to affirm that it was their state representatives sitting in Congress who had the decision-making power whether to resist the government of Great Britain or not.
And the militia units that formed during the American Revolution were always exclusively tied to the states. That model that the American Revolution gives us of American people acting in concert, legally, and under the color of duly elected representatives, that is the model of how Americans are supposed to resist a tyrannical government.
If you want to live in a state of war, however, Thomas Jefferson himself and his patriot cousin, Richard Bland, conceived of an out for you. When men enter into society, they retain so much of their natural freedom as to have a right to retire from the society, to renounce the benefits of it, to enter into another society, and to settle in another country. For their engagements to the society and their submission to the public authority of the state do not oblige them to continue in it longer than they find it will conduce to their happiness. The citizen's militia ideal still exerts a powerful enchantment, like the same allure of the cowboy or the pioneer. But it has increasingly been proved to be an impractical institution in American society, and a failed substitute to a professional military. The United States went to war again with Great Britain, the War of 1812, prosecuted under the administration of James Madison. At the Battle of Bladensburg in August 1814, the militia units Madison was depending on to protect our nation's capital fled when confronted by professional British troops. The British went on to burn the White House and the U.S. Capitol. In 1818, Secretary of War and future Vice President John C. Calhoun of South Carolina admitted a standing army in peace in the present improved state of the military science is an indispensable preparation to resist with success wars, calamities, and dangers. Even a small government Southern icon like John C. Calhoun was admitting that the militia had outlived its original purpose. Among the people, militia musters petered out, and the militia became largely an object of ridicule. From the supposition that the individual right to keep and bear arms includes military-grade weapons, to the idea that the militia must include everyone and is decentralized and ad hoc, to our unfounded reverence for self-described armed patriots standing at the ready to overthrow the government, we have now ironed flat all the bulges of the funhouse mirror so many of us have been using to view the Second Amendment. So, in conclusion, because all 50 state constitutions expressly designate the elected governor as commander-in-chief of the militia, every governor in the Union has the power, with a stroke of his or her pen, to instantly impose an assault weapons ban that covers his or her state. And they can do this under the color of their authority as commander-in-chief to arm or disarm, call up or disband the state militia. And that has no conflict at all with the Second Amendment because, as we've seen, modern assault weapons would have been construed by the Founding Fathers to be military-grade weapons, the prerogative of the state militia forces, and nothing to do with the individual right to keep and bear arms, to acquire and defend property. And so if you are one of the many American citizens who want something done to keep assault weapons out of the hands of dangerous people who would use them to create harm in society, know this, that hundreds of years of American history are actually backing your side. Just make Tallahassee, Frankfurt, Columbia, Austin, Pierre, Juneau, Augusta, Sacramento your first stops before Washington, D.C.